Good morning, Eastpoint. It is great having you worshiping with us. There are many paradoxes of life. A paradox, it's when two realities that appear to be contradictory are put together, but when you peer beneath the surface, you find a depth of meaning in those two realities coexisting. For example, a paradox is the more connected we get, the more isolated we feel. It's a paradox of our culture today. Here's a paradox. It's kind of a famous one. Have you heard of the buttered cat paradox? It goes like this. Cats always land on their feet, but buttered bread always lands butter side down. But that raises the question, if you strap buttered bread to the back of a cat, what would happen? Mary and I have a hairless cat. It's kind of creepy looking. And he is always cold, and we've always known we have to be really careful about the dryer because he would want to crawl in the dryer. And so, like, whenever we have people, like, house sitting, we put a note on the dryer, check for Harry, and, like, we do a Harry check anytime we start the dryer. Guys, we've had this cat for 6 years. Last week I started the dryer with Harry in it. Thankfully, I did a Harry check, and I found him in the dryer. He's fine. Let's not put this online. Thank you. That was bonus. Here's another paradox. The only constant is change. It's a paradox of life. In many ways, the Christmas season feels like a paradox. We've got songs like, "It's the most wonderful time of the year." And we wear sweaters sporting the words merry and bright. And yet, this week in our calendar year marks the shortest days of the year. Sunlight is limited. Your schedules are probably slammed. Expectations are high. And the season for many feels frazzled and dark rather than merry and bright. It's a paradox. The temptation for all of us is to run from the paradox, to hide the tension we feel beneath the tinsel and toys, to turn Mariah Carey up a little louder so that the weight we carry might feel a little bit lighter. However, the season of Advent is an invitation not to run from paradox, but to embrace it. During the season, we pause to ponder the great paradox, the greatest paradox of all of history. The moment when God became a man, fully divine, fully man. And it's here as we reflect on the incarnation, when God became man, God took on flesh, that we hear the words of the angels ring out, "Do not be afraid, I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all people. Today, in the town of David has been born to you, a Savior has been born to you. He is the Messiah, the Lord." These iconic words which mark the coming of Christ, good news of great joy, ring out in the night with a sentiment of paradox. If the coming of Jesus is good news of great joy, why do I feel so much sorrow? In a world that is still full of sorrow and sighing, darkness and depression, grief and gloom, the question I have for us this morning is, how do we experience the joy that the coming of Jesus brings? I imagine that Jesus knew his disciples would be wrestling with some of this as he was headed to the cross. In John chapter 14, verse 17, we have what's called the farewell discourse, this moment when Jesus sits down with his followers and gives them kind of a last pep talk before he heads to his crucifixion. And essentially, these chapters of John 14 through 17 are Jesus' encouragement and prayers for his followers as his time on earth is coming to a close. And Jesus knows that there are plenty of things in this weary world that will trouble our hearts. So how do we experience joy in a weary world becomes part of Jesus' theme in these chapters. 3 times in these chapters, we see Jesus point us to joy as one of the purposes of his coming. In John 15, verse 11, he says, I have told you this so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. In chapter 16, the passage we just read, he says, so with you, now is your time of grief, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy. And then a couple verses later, and your joy will be complete. Jump to chapter 17, verse 13. He says, I'm coming to you now, but I say these things while I am still in the world, so that they may have the full measure of my joy within them. You see, it's clear in Jesus' farewell discourse with his followers that Jesus wants you and me to experience joy. And not just like a little joy tossed in the Christmas season. Like, this is like comprehensive, complete, and full joy that he is describing to his followers. And when we consider, when we consider the overarching purpose of the book of John, which we've seen clearly in chapter 20, verse 31, where he says, this is the purpose I came. These are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And so if we take the purpose of the Gospel of John, that you may have life, real life, abundant and full life. And if you take Jesus' words in the farewell discourse, that I want you to have complete and full joy, I think we can make some kind of connection that the life that's found in Jesus is meant to lead us to joy in the midst of sorrow. That there is some kind of connection between these two things, and I want us to explore that here in John chapter 16. If you have a Bible, let's open back up to the passage we read just a moment ago in John 16 and consider the paradox of a weary world rejoicing. Here's what I want us to focus on in this reality of joy is John chapter 16, verse 22. It says this, so with you, now is your time of grief, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice. And let these words sink in. And no one will take away your joy. Now, I don't know about you, but when it comes to the Christmas season, there's a lot of joy that has a shelf life. I was thinking through, Mary and I the other night took inventory of like what we're giving our boys for Christmas. And I was doing this like joy math in my head, like how long is that going to last? You know, like when is that going to like be in the corner and we're looking for the next thing? We know what joy that has a shelf life looks like. But Jesus is describing here something categorically different. A joy that nothing, that no one can steal. I don't know about you, but that's enticing to me. And yet it feels like a paradox. It feels like, how can that exist in a weary, sorrowful, dark, and gloomy world? And this is what I want us to get this morning as we reflect on these verses, is that the coming of Jesus turns anguish into a joy that is not stolen by sorrow. The coming of Jesus turns anguish into a joy that is not stolen by sorrow. And this is what Jesus describes here. You notice in the verses we read leading up to this, the disciples are a little bit confused about what Jesus is talking about. He's saying, for now, like you are experiencing grief, but in a little while you're going to experience joy. Right now the world is rejoicing. What they don't realize, Jesus is talking about what's about to happen. Jesus is about to go to the cross, the moment when the world rejoices. Why does the world rejoice? Well, John says that Jesus was the light that entered the darkness. What does the darkness feel about the light? Well, it exposes it. And there's something convicting about that. And what we find in the gospel narratives is that what took Jesus to the cross was that the world rejoices in self-sufficiency rather than the light that came to bring real and abundant life. And so Jesus is describing the moment when he is going to go to the cross. The world rejoices. And he says, but soon your anguish will turn to joy. Your grief will turn to joy. Notice how Jesus describes that in these verses when he says, in verse 20, I tell you, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. And he gives an illustration now. A woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come. But when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child is born into the world. The coming of Jesus is a coming that turns anguish into joy. And it is a joy that does not diminish or ignore the pain, but finds delight that far outweighs all of it. And that is what Jesus is holding out to his disciples. A gladness, a deep gladness of the heart that cannot be taken by circumstances. He's describing a gladness of the heart that is only found in the coming of the one who was able to rob the grave. And hear this, the joy of Jesus cannot be robbed from you because Jesus has robbed the grave. Our greatest enemy in life, death itself, Jesus went to take that upon himself so that you and I could experience life to the full, so that we could experience joy. And so what Jesus is describing is his death is a moment of sorrow and grief for his disciples, but joy is coming. Why? Because 3 days later he rose from the dead, and we find the glorious truth that the resurrection anchors our hope and secures our joy. And so he describes a joy that is coming, a joy that has come. And we sit here this morning in the tension between the two. In Isaiah chapter 35, it describes a day when sorrow and sighing will flee. And every time I read those verses, I say, come, Lord Jesus. And we live between the now of what is and what is to come when Jesus will make all things new. There is a joy coming that is free from sorrow, but what Jesus came to bring and has brought and offers to you this morning is a joy in the midst of the sorrow. A joy that cannot be stolen by sorrow. There is a joy coming when sorrow and sighing will flee, but that hope produces a joy in the midst of the sorrow and sighing. And this is the message of Advent. That when God took on flesh, when he stepped into our messy world, the God of all joy, the God of eternal joy, experienced our sorrows so that in our sorrows we would experience lasting joy. Guys, this is the message of Christmas. That the God of eternal joy, who in and of his own existence is delight and joy, experienced our sorrows. He became the man of sorrows so that in our sorrows we would experience lasting joy, something that cannot be stolen from you. And so the invitation of this passage is that there is joy, not in spite of, but in the midst of what you're carrying this morning. Some of you in the midst of we're like T-minus like how many days to Christmas, and you're feeling it. And the weight of the busyness and the pressures of family expectations, some of you are just feeling some of the conflict that is impending. And Jesus invites you into something that can coexist with the tears, that can coexist with the sorrow, that can meet you in the midst of what you're walking through. Why? Because he He has been there. Just a few chapters before this, we find him at the funeral of Lazarus, and we find those famous words, Jesus wept. And then he turns to Mary and Martha and he says, I am the resurrection and the life. Because I live, you also will live. And because he lives, we have a joy that cannot be robbed by the sorrows of this world. C.S. Lewis described joy as an unsatisfied desire, which itself is more desirable than any other satisfaction. Let that sink in for a minute, that unsatisfied desire, that we are longing for something greater than our present experience of reality, that unsatisfied desire, which in itself, grounded in the hope of the resurrection, is more desirable than any other satisfaction. That is true and lasting joy, that we have a hope that anchors us and a joy that gives us stability in the midst of what is. John Piper describes this in his Advent book, The Dawning of Indestructible Joy. The meaning of Christmas is that what is good and precious in your life need never be lost, and what is evil and undesirable in your life can be changed. The fears that a few good things that make you happy are slipping through your fingers, and the frustrations that the bad things you hate about yourself and your situation can't be changed. These fears and these frustrations are what Christmas came to destroy. It is God's message of hope this Advent, that what is good need never be lost, and what is bad can be changed. And Jesus said, your sorrow I will turn to joy. There will be a day when sorrow and sighing will flee. Paul describes in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 10, he is sorrowful, yet always rejoicing, poor, yet making many rich, having nothing, yet possessing everything. And I think there, embedded in that description of life, is the key to joy in the midst of sorrow. Possessing nothing, and yet having everything. And that's what Jesus offers to us, is that those things that have a shelf life, they will come and go. Like those hopes and expectations you have for the next 2 weeks, the things that you hope will work out, they will eventually fade away. Those joys are temporary. Did you know a Twinkie only has a shelf life of like 26 days? It's like a misnomer that it could survive a nuclear bombing. Like a Twinkie will expire. The joys of Christmas, as our world knows it, will fade away. But Jesus also offers us a joy that will last. This illustration that Jesus uses of a woman in labor. Several years ago, Mary started studying to become a doula, to come alongside women in labor and birth, and to help them through that process. And she often just will come home from, yesterday she was meeting with a couple, and she'll come home and talk about how like her job is just to help these women know that they can get through this and that joy is on the other side. And she often describes that bliss of right after the baby arrives, where the anguish of the moment dissipates. Why? Is she still in pain? Yeah. But the child has arrived. The joy has come. And so we as a church in the season of Advent sit in the paradox of joy. We sit in the paradox that there is pain, that there is sorrow, that there is injustice, that there is a weary world that we walk. And there is joy. And the delight of what has come in Christ far outweighs, as it says in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, that these light momentary afflictions are preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to what we see, but what we do not see. For what is seen is transient, but what is unseen is eternal. The incarnation, God taking on flesh, is the tangible embodiment of the gospel reality that sorrow and joy can coexist. So Advent invites us to peer into the crude accommodations of Christ's birth, to hear the cries of agony from a teenage mother, to imagine the tears pouring down her cheeks, to feel the tension of chaos as moans of delivery were drowned out by the blaring bellows of cattle. It's here that we find lying in the stench of a stable the God of eternal joy. Advent reminds us of the hope that joy is coming, and sorrows and sighing will one day flee. But until that day, we return to the manger to remember that joy entered our sorrow, so that in our sorrow we may have joy. This is the invitation of the gospel. If you're here this morning and you're like, I don't even know what that kind of joy is, Jesus is holding out an invitation of faith. At the heart of all of this is Jesus is saying, you want to experience delight and gladness in your heart that isn't dependent upon circumstances? You got to step out and trust me, that I am the resurrection and the life, that I am the one your soul is created for. And the invitation of Jesus to you today is to trust him. Say, I don't want to trust in myself, because that has a shelf life. But I want to put my trust in the one who overcame the grave, who is eternal, and whose joy will outlast any sorrow.